People make mistakes, and this is absolutely normal, but I was completely shocked by my wife's mistake. She wanted to set me up with her lover so that I would end up in prison. The worst thing is that I didn't do anything wrong to these people. They just wanted to ruin my life. But I was not so simple. The world started to blur as I sat down on my bedroom floor. Saying I was exhausted was an understatement. Just a week ago, I never would have imagined being here, doing what I was doing now. Sitting there, I could feel the texture of the carpet against my wet hands. Kelly and I had spent a lot of money renovating the bedroom a few years back. It had a good underlay and high-quality Australian wool carpet. It was a shame that the carpet was being ruined now. I closed my eyes for a moment and shook my head slightly, trying to clear the fog that was clouding my mind. What was I doing, I thought. I'm above this, I thought for a moment. When I opened my eyes again, I saw a large, king-sized bed with a wooden frame. The next time I blinked, Kelly appeared in front of me when we were making love. I cringed, knowing it would never happen again. Events got out of control. I brought my hands to my face and, in my madness, smirked as the warm, wet blood smeared across my skin. I let my hands drop to my sides again, further soaking the carpet with the liquid pouring from me. The world was growing blurry, but my eyes quickly caught the glint of the half-empty whiskey bottle lying on the bed next to an empty pill bottle. When I had thrown back the pills and downed the whiskey, I had forgotten to put the cap back on. Now, the room reeked of alcohol. I laughed bitterly and shrugged, but a sudden panicked thought hit me. The letters. I quickly turned my head and saw they were still there, my messy handwriting scrawled on the front of each envelope. They were on the bedside table, not on the mattress where I feared the open bottle might ruin them. There was always a risk that the wrong person would find my letters, but I dismissed the thought as soon as it crossed my mind. The one remaining rational part of my brain knew I wouldn't be around to worry about it, so what did it matter? I coughed briefly, feeling bile rise in my stomach. I didn't want to vomit, so I fought down the urge. Why? As I closed my eyes again, I wondered why it had to happen this way. Why did I do this? Sure, there were people I would miss, even though I doubted they would miss me. Sure, my daughter would hate me for taking this way out. But I believed she already loathed me, having cast me aside in disgust this past week, and I couldn't bear it anymore. I didn't want the pain anymore. Even now, as the vital liquid that circulates in all our bodies continued to escape from me, ruining the carpet, the pain and anguish remained. A week ago, the person I was would have knocked me into next week for doing this. The man I used to be wouldn't have taken these measures, but I wasn't that person anymore. I was broken, unwanted, despised, and saw no other way out than to give them all what they wanted. I closed my eyes and winced again at the pain in my wrists, but thanks to the pills and whiskey, it was a dull ache instead of sharp, crippling pain. As I drifted closer to eternal slumber, I didn't see my life flash before my eyes. There were no tunnels of light or ominous red stairs lurking in the darkness. I was somewhat surprised. I guess I expected something. No, that's wrong. Knowing I had mere moments left, I felt terror. My synapses' struggle to form coherent thoughts was coming to an end. My brain clung to life even as I could no longer stop the inevitable march toward doom. I felt foolish. I wanted to survive. In a last-ditch effort to overcome my foolishness, I tried to move but felt myself slumping to the floor with no energy left as the blackness finally claimed me. 1 week earlier, I laughed joyfully as I spun my daughter Grace around our suburban home in downtown Perth, Australia. She was 19, and her boyfriend John had proposed to her the previous night. Of course, I had seen it coming. John had approached me privately to ask for my blessing, which I gave without hesitation. Grace and John had been together since 8th grade, and I could count on one hand the number of weekends they hadn't spent together since they started dating. Grace was excitedly recounting the proposal to my wife, Kelly, and me. John had sent her on a treasure hunt around town, culminating under a tree in Kings Park where he proposed. When they shared the news with us in the kitchen the next day, I had hugged her and spun her around like she was 5 years old. I was thrilled for them. Despite their youth, I believed their love was strong. If any young couple could make it in today's world, it was them. I took my daughter's hand again and smiled as I admired the engagement ring. "It's beautiful, Gracie," I said, looking over at John. "You did a great job picking it out." My wife Kelly snorted from the other side of the kitchen counter. At 42, Kelly was still a stunning woman to me. She had deep brunette hair, brown eyes, and a tanned complexion many women envied. We all turned to look at her in response to my compliment. "You should give me some of that credit," my wife said, picking up a glass of wine. "You might have given your blessing, but I was the one who helped John choose it." I was surprised, and I saw John turning bright red. "Mom, that was unnecessary," Grace said, then turned to her fiancé. "It's all right, baby. I love it, and I know you made the final choice." Nothing more was said, but I must admit I felt a bit embarrassed by Kelly's comment. In all the years we had been together, I'd never seen my wife say something so disrespectful and out of character, embarrassing everyone in the room. However, upon reflection, Kelly had been acting a bit strange over the past few months. Nothing specific came to mind at the moment, but there were small things, comments and actions, that weren't characteristic of the loving woman I knew, seeping into the person who had just embarrassed us. Dinner remained festive as we continued to toast and celebrate the newly engaged couple. Eventually, Grace and John left after enjoying the apple crumble and vanilla custard I had made earlier in the afternoon. They had a small one-bedroom apartment they were leasing with our help while studying and beginning their careers. That night, as Kelly and I snuggled into bed, I didn't say anything. But I must admit that inappropriate comment lingered in my thoughts. On Sunday morning, Kelly and I slowly woke up. We started making love. After that, I saw the expression of bliss on her face, but suddenly it changed. She got off me and went into the bathroom, leaving me unfinished. I was stunned. Kelly?" I called out. "What is it?" "What is it?" she asked in a slightly irritated voice from the bathroom. "Is there anything for me?" I asked. It took a while before she answered. "I'm already coming to my senses. Just get yourself cleaned up." A few moments later, Kelly came out, looked at me, grinned, and left. It took me about half an hour to recover. I was so shocked. I showered and shaved, and when I went out to the kitchen, Kelly had already left. She just left a note saying she was leaving. Suddenly, I felt a surge of anger. In all the years I'd known Kelly, she had never disrespected me the way she did this morning. I couldn't understand what was going on with my wife. As I made myself a coffee, one thought kept haunting me. Is she cheating on me? I was finishing my coffee, still brooding over the situation, when Roger, one of my closest friends, called. "Hey Bart, what's up?" he greeted cheerfully. I responded with a generic greeting, not revealing my turmoil. "Bart, buddy, something's off. What's wrong?" Roger asked, sensing my distress. I spent the next 10 minutes explaining my concerns to Roger, who laughed at my worries. "Buddy, if she's cheating, there's not much you can do. Divorce is 50-50, and since she doesn't work, she'd take you to the cleaners," he said. "Not helpful," I replied, irritated by his attitude. "I wasn't trying to be. I was just being realistic," said Roger, showing little empathy. "Look, why don't we talk about it at work tomorrow? We have the Pembroke project report due, and after that we can discuss it." "Sounds good," I responded without much enthusiasm. Roger wasn't just a good friend. We also worked at the same company. I was a senior engineer, and he was a program manager. Over the years, we had formed a great team. I would develop the solutions, and he would handle the budget and schedule. I somehow got through Sunday. Kelly did come home, but it was almost midnight when she slipped into bed. She didn't say anything, even though she knew I was awake. The next morning, Kelly tried to be gentle to wake her up. She was obviously hoping for something. I pushed her away at the last moment. "This can't be happening, Kelly," I said, getting out of bed. "Are you giving up on intimacy?" "What is it?" she asked, looking at me with disbelief. I glowered at her and started putting on my day suit. I won't touch you after you disrespected me last weekend. I swear if you're cheating on me. I paused, not knowing how to finish. Kelly was right in front of my face. What are you going to do, Bartholomew the other? There's nothing you can do. She said my full name with a slight grin that softened but didn't completely disappear. Go back to bed. I need to relax a little bit, and I know you need it too. She tried to persuade me. I shook my head in disbelief. Who was this woman? No, Kelly. That's not going to happen, I said firmly. You don't seem to realize how disrespectful you are to me. Well, to hell with you, she retorted, turning away and grabbing a toy from the bedside table. Lying down on the bed, she looked at me defiantly, teasing and mocking. You could be here with me, baby, she purred seductively. It could have been you, not this toy. I shook my head and left the room. For the first time in 21 years of our marriage, I felt disgusted with my wife. When I left the house, her mocking sounds haunted me, branding me a weakling and a coward. That morning at the office, I was distracted by something. My assistant Myra noticed it right away. Bart, are you all right? You look upset, she asked with concern on her face. Myra Brown worked at the company for 10 years, being a capable assistant who often joked that she got the job out of pity. She came to the interview with a black eye, leaving behind an abusive relationship in which there was nothing but clothes on herself and 1-year-old daughter Tilly. Apart from the brief incident with the black eye during her interview, which quickly healed, Myra was a strong candidate for the job. She generally dressed conservatively, though it was undeniable that she possessed striking physical features. With nearly natural platinum blonde hair flowing to her waist and a figure that seemed to defy gravity, she attracted attention. Myra also had a presence that turned heads, including a well-proportioned physique and a natural elegance that was hard to overlook. Personally, I had occasionally found myself admiring her, though never making it overt. Despite a past incident involving an abusive ex-boyfriend that resulted in an unexpected pregnancy, Myra showed exceptional intelligence and wit, easily keeping pace with the demands of our work. Recognizing her potential, the firm owner hired her and specifically assigned her to assist me in project delivery, believing her talents would be wasted in a reception role. I admired Myra not only for her genuine care for those around her and her unwavering moral principles, but also for her approach to friendships, warm until crossed, after which she could be unforgiving. Several individuals had even lost their jobs for underestimating her, assuming she was merely a charming but unserious woman. As I pondered how to broach the topic of my troubles with Kelly to Myra, I eventually sighed and opted for honesty. Throughout my narrative, Myra's expression turned from contemplative to a deep frown, and by the end, her anger was evident, a flush creeping up her neck. After recounting my tale, I couldn't help but feel defeated, realizing my suspicion that my wife might be cheating on me. I'm at a loss, Myra. I never saw this coming, I admitted sadly. Suddenly, I felt Myra's hand on my shoulder. Physical contact between us had always been rare during our years of working together. I looked into her compassionate eyes. Well, Myra began. First, you need to get through the Pembroke meeting. I just received the schedule, and there are concerns about the materials used in the structure, particularly the pipe and concrete. I grounded myself in her words, returning to the present moment. I was taken aback. Why is this the first time I'm hearing about it? Roger hasn't mentioned a word to me, I replied. Thoughts raced through my mind about the structures, architectural layouts, and quantities I had meticulously planned. Myra appeared uneasy. I'm not sure why this hasn't been communicated, Bart. I just saw the agenda, and it's troubling. Before we could dwell on it further, Roger appeared at my office door. Are you ready, buddy? He asked cheerfully. Roger, what's this about issues with pipes and concrete on the Pembroke project? I whispered, preparing myself for the impending meeting. He waved it off. Don't worry about it. We'll sort it out now. Roger, you know I prefer to be informed before client meetings, I insisted. It's fine, buddy. We'll handle it, Roger replied dismissively. The meeting felt like an ambush. As we entered, the owners of Pembroke were already seated. I had met them several times before, always on friendly terms. But as I detailed our progress, their expressions soured. What about the cost overruns with the concrete and pipes in the Northeast? Peter, the CEO, queried. I glanced at Roger, but he offered no support, leaving all eyes on me. I'll need to investigate, I responded, feeling blindsided. Up until last week, our reports indicated everything was within expected parameters. Peter's scowl deepened as he confronted me. This can't be true. Why have I signed requisition reports totaling over $200,000 for extra concrete and pipe over the last 3 months? I stared back, utterly at a loss for words. I glanced over at Roger, whose expression was inscrutable. He retrieved a folder and stood up. Gentlemen, if you'll excuse us for a moment, I'm confident we can resolve this, Roger said, gesturing towards me. Bart, let's step out and sort through this. I followed Roger across the hall into another room where Clarence, our boss, was waiting. So, what did they say? Clarence asked as we took our seats. Roger intervened quickly, handing a folder to Clarence. They inquired about the missing materials, just as we anticipated, he responded. Clarence turned to me, his eyes filled with anger directed at me for the first time in all our years working together. What do you have to say, Bartholomew? The older man practically spat at me. I was taken aback by the intensity of his tone and the hostile glare he shot my way. I'm at a loss for words, sir. Last week's reports indicated everything was on track with no additional materials needed. I have no knowledge of these signed requisitions, let alone approving them, I replied to my visibly angry boss, sensing the situation spiraling out of control. He scrutinized me for a moment, then opened the folder handed to him by Roger. So, that's your story? Clarence said flatly. Sir? I queried, then glanced at Roger, who appeared solemn. Bartholomew, here are requisition forms totaling $206,000. The payments were made to an account under your name. Seriously, Bartholomew, is this how you repay me after all these years? Clarence nearly shouted. The meeting devolved from there. Both Clarence and Roger took turns berating me for actions they accused me of. They showed no interest in my protests of innocence. Human Resources was brought in, and I was promptly terminated for fraud. Clarence informed me he was involving the police, and to add insult to injury, Myra, who worked closely with me, was also being dismissed for her alleged involvement. As I was escorted out with my few belongings, I caught Roger smirking at me when he thought I wasn't looking. In the parking lot, I found Myra, tears streaming down her face, looking dazed beside her car, security keeping a close watch to prevent us from re-entering the building. Myra, are you okay? I inquired. She turned towards me abruptly. You despicable Bartholomew. $200,000 in fraud. How could you do this? I trusted you, and because of you, I lost my job, the distressed woman yelled at me. Myra, I swear it wasn't me, I pleaded. Not you? She hesitated, a sneer appearing on her face. Before they escorted me out, Roger showed me the requisition forms with your signature. I know your signature. How could you? She glared at me, her eyes filled with nothing but hatred directed at me. She didn't want to hear that I was innocent. And I guess that emotional story about Kelly was just another fabrication, accusing her of cheating on you. Do you really think I'm oblivious to the way you look at me when you think I'm not paying attention? Once more, the sight of pure, unfiltered rage caught me off guard in my colleague of 10 years. I despise you, she spat. You've ruined any chance I had of finding another job. I can't believe I let myself pity you. You lie, cheat, and steal, and then have the nerve to ask how I'm doing. Get lost, Bart. In all our years of working together, I had never heard her swear. Her words stunned me anew. Before I could react, she slapped me hard across the face. You've destroyed my career. I can't get a decent reference now, and worst of all, I'm tainted by your deceit. I hope it was all worth it, you bastard." I stood there in shock, my cheek stinging from the force of her slap. Myra glared at me for another moment before she got into her car and drove off without another word. I returned home unsure of what else to do and parked in the driveway. Inside, Kelly was waiting for me. "So the cheating husband slinks home. Pathetic," she spat. At the time, I didn't realize it, but in the days that followed, I would think back and realize Kelly sounded happy. Not upset, not concerned. Happy. What the hell? "Kelly, I didn't do any of it. I have no idea what's going on," I said, feeling crushed, confused, and on the verge of falling apart. She sneered at me. "Who cares, Bart? I'm telling you right now, I'm leaving you pathetic." I had never seen such contempt in her eyes before, well, except perhaps for the look Myra gave me earlier. There was a knock at the door. "It's for you," she said, still glaring at me. Without hesitating for a second, I opened the door to the man in the suit. "Mr. Bartholomew Otter?" he asked. I nodded silently. "You have been served," he announced, handing me a thick manila envelope before leaving. I looked inside and took the divorce papers. "Kelly, are you getting a divorce?" My world has been shaken even more. Kelly sensed my growing despair and laughed happily at my pain. "You're so ignorant, aren't you? Of course, this is a divorce. In case you haven't noticed, I've been seeing someone for the last 6 months. He goes where you don't go, he's amazing, and, well, he's got money," she sneered, looking at me with disdain. "As for you, you have lost your job, family, friends, and let's not forget that you will probably end up in prison soon for fraud." She gave me a brief, sadistic look full of satisfaction. Over the past few months, I've noticed that this expression has become even more explicit. I was puzzled as to why I only noticed it now. "You're pathetic, Bart. The only thing you had was the ability to use your language. My new man isn't that skilled and doesn't know how you do it, but he does other things for me that you've never been able to do." "So you admit that you're a cheater?" I retorted, anger in my voice. Kelly laughed. "Yes, it was always centered around me. I deserve everything. Haven't you realized it's always been about me?" She glanced at me, a hint of sadness fleeting across her face for a moment. "We did have many good years together." The look passed, and her harsh demeanor returned. "But you're finished, Bart. I'm moving on." Kelly leaned closer as my world continued to crumble. "Listen, Bart, just make it simple for me. I want the house and most of our assets because you're going to jail. So sign the papers. I'm being generous, giving you a week to pack up and leave. But by this time next week, you better be out of this house or I'll slap you with a restraining order on top of everything else." "You'll be staying with your lover then?" I asked, feeling the weight of betrayal from my job and now my wife. She chuckled again. "Of course, his place is much smaller, which is why we'll take over this place once you're locked up. But don't try to follow me or I'll have you arrested for stalking on top of everything else. You're already headed for jail. Don't make it worse." I sank into a chair, defeated and abandoned. Kelly took a few steps towards me. Then she noticed the red handprint Myra had left earlier. She glanced at my red cheek and smirked. "At least this woman got what she deserved. Go crawl into a hole and die, Bartholomew." With that, Kelly walked out. I spent the rest of the day in silence, not even touching a drink. The next day was no different. I was waiting for something. I tried calling Grace, but it went straight to voicemail. After about the 20th attempt, she finally picked up. "What do you want?" my daughter asked sharply. "Grace, I began. "Save it, Dad," Grace cut me off, her tone harsh and unforgiving. "Mom told me everything. Your fraud, the lies, your affair with your assistant, cheating on Mom, and stealing $200,000. You've ruined so many lives with that. I've never been more disappointed in anyone." I was speechless. There was a moment of silence before I gathered myself to respond, but Grace spoke again before I could. "Listen, I'll be direct," Grace said heatedly over the phone. "John and I want nothing to do with you. You're on the news, under police investigation. Mom filled me in. Go to jail, Dad. Serve your time and stay away from us. I hate to say this, but if you're not in jail when we marry, don't come. I won't have someone who could destroy our family near me on my wedding day. I'll find someone else to walk me down the aisle." I couldn't speak, tears streaming down my face. "Dad, are you even listening? Do you understand what you've done?" I remained silent, sobbing audibly. "Goodbye, Dad. You're dead to me now. Don't ever try to contact me again. Ever." Her final words hung in the air as she hung up abruptly. With that, I collapsed to the floor and wept. 2 days later, law enforcement arrived at my doorstep, placed me under arrest, and brought me in for questioning. The detectives who detained me skipped over any inquiry into my innocence and instead bombarded me with questions about the whereabouts of the money, the identities of my accomplices, and the duration of my fraudulent activities at my former workplace. Eventually, they released me, instructing me to remain in town for an impending court appearance the following week. As I entered my home, I surveyed everything around me. Photographs on the walls featuring Kelly, Grace, and me, artwork we had collected, and trophies Grace had earned through her school sports achievements. What had once been filled with memories and happiness now felt hollow and devoid of meaning. The past week had been a whirlwind. Deep down, I sensed there were crucial aspects of this situation that eluded me. Despite knowing my innocence, I felt disconnected and lost. My wife had left me, my daughter had turned her back, I had lost my job, my assistant blamed me, and even a close friend had abandoned me without a second thought. The few calls I answered were from former friends expressing their disappointment in me. They repeatedly made it clear they never wanted to hear from me again. I was toxic. Merely being near me was intolerable. I entered the bedroom shattered, unsure of my next move. As an engineer, I was used to solving problems, but I couldn't identify the problem I was facing now. After showering, I went downstairs and ate a sandwich made with stale bread and jam, its cardboard taste amplifying my already bleak existence. Perhaps I could have managed it all if Grace hadn't cut me out of her life. I stared at the table in front of me. There were sleeping pills that Kelly used and an unopened bottle of American honey whiskey. For the first time, a dark thought crossed my mind about what would happen if I consumed both. I shook my head. That wasn't the solution. I just needed some time. The next morning, early in the morning, I was served again. This time, it was an injunction, forbidding me to get closer than 100 meters to Kelly, Grace, John, or Roger. In addition, I was ordered to leave the house by next Monday. Amid a growing sense of helplessness, it struck me that Roger was included in the injunction, which seemed strange. Why Roger? It means that something is not good. "Damn it!" I shouted into the void. Driven by rage and a deep sense of betrayal, I impulsively sent him a text message. "You idiot. It's all your fault. Do you call yourself a friend? I'll find you and make you pay." I received no response. However, 30 minutes later, the same 2 detectives who had arrested me returned. They reprimanded me for violating the restraining order by contacting Roger. They showed no interest in my explanations or desire to hear my side of the story. To them, I was simply the villain. They made it clear I needed to vacate the house by Sunday and informed me of my arraignment scheduled for Monday. They warned me that a detective would be parked across the street, watching me for the next 24 hours. I was strongly advised not to leave the house, only to pack my things. After a heated exchange with the detectives, I returned to the house and succumbed to the temptation of opening a bottle of whiskey. 3 shots in 10 minutes, drowning my sorrows. I grabbed 3 pieces of paper and decided to write notes to Kelly, Grace, and Myra. In Kelly's note, I expressed my disappointment. I called her a traitorous woman and wished her a fiery fate in hell for what she had done to me. I filled the paper with every bitter word I could muster, then spat on it before folding it into an envelope. To Grace, I expressed my sadness and disappointment that she never inquired if I had committed the accusations against me. I assured her that I had never done any of the things I was accused of. I clarified that I had never cheated on her mother. In fact, it was her mother who had cheated on me. I also denied stealing any money, suggesting that her belief otherwise indicated a need for her to mature, and question who was feeding her such falsehoods. Softening my tone, I advised her to love John wholeheartedly and to think kindly of me once things settled down. Lastly, I requested that she ensure Roger wouldn't be the one walking her down the aisle in my place, as he had betrayed me. Tears dampened the paper once more as I sealed the letter in its envelope. To Myra, I penned an apology. I began by assuring her that none of the situation was her fault. Then I outlined what I believed I knew about Roger's betrayal that had affected us both, suspecting he was now involved with my wife. I expressed regret if my shy glances had ever made her uncomfortable, explaining they were merely admiring gestures stemming from working alongside such a remarkable woman. I emphasized my deep respect for her and apologized if my actions had tarnished that. Lastly, I concluded by admitting my sense of being trapped and asked if, with time, she could forgive me once her anger had subsided. I carefully sealed each letter in its envelope, addressing them to their respective recipients. Placing them on the bedside table, I fetched a bottle of whiskey and another of sleeping pills before heading upstairs. A sigh escaped me as I laid out the letters. Then, on a whim, I scribbled a note on a post-it, advising the detectives to scrutinize Roger's finances for the truth. I added that they should do their duty next time instead of driving an innocent man to this end. Afterward, I retreated to the bathroom for a leisurely hot shower. I took a few more swallows of whiskey, swallowed all the pills, and dried off, staring at my reflection in the mirror. This wasn't like me at all. Yet I had a plan, an exit from this chaos. If the world no longer had use for me, I would remove myself from it. My straight razor lay on the counter, beckoning for a final task. I took a last swig of whiskey, then tossed the bottle and empty pill container onto the bed as I returned to the room. Strangely calm, I dressed neatly, dress pants, casual shoes, and a smart shirt, before collapsing just outside the bathroom, the alcohol and pills beginning to take effect. I held the razor in my hand, its sharp edge gleaming. As I considered its finality, I knew the pain would be brief, but the relief permanent. They didn't want me around, didn't care to hear me out, so I would ensure they never had to again. Later, I learned that Detective David Roundlight had saved my life. He had been assigned to surveil my house that evening, parked in an unmarked car across the street. When Mrs. Hawkins, one of our neighbors who seemed oblivious to the events, came by to check on us after noticing unusual activity during the week, Detective Roundlight met her at my front door. After their attempts to get a response failed, he entered the unlocked door and searched the house, eventually discovering me unconscious and bleeding in the bedroom. An ambulance arrived shortly afterward, and the house was quickly transformed into a crime scene. Looking back, it was the first stroke of luck I had all week. I was barely conscious when they found me. Thankfully, my body's reflexes kicked in and I vomited, preventing further harm. Under Detective Roundlight's direction, forensic investigators were called in. They seized the whiskey, pill bottle, and letters, and during their search of the house uncovered 3 hidden cameras connected to a concealed hard drive in the laundry cupboard. I had been completely unaware of their existence. I regained consciousness after 3 days, and to my surprise, I found myself still alive. Where am I?" I rasped, addressing a nurse who appeared quite fetching. "You're at Hollywood Private Hospital," she murmured softly, placing a finger to her lips. "Shh," she cautioned. "Your friend here has been awake all night and just dozed off." "Friend?" I queried weakly, arching an eyebrow. "I thought everyone had abandoned me." "Well, this one didn't," she replied, turning my gaze to a disheveled Myra, uncomfortably napping in one of those oversized faux leather chairs typical of hospitals. Myra, I whispered, a sense of relief washing over me. At the sound of her name, she stirred from her sleep. Despite everything, the moment she noticed I was awake, she was by my side, her hand slipping into mine. "Bart, what were you thinking?" she demanded sharply. Yet her grip was gentle, and her eyes, though bloodshot from crying, betrayed tears held back. I looked away. "I thought it was the only way," I began, shame engulfing me. She scoffed. "Did you really think taking your own life was the answer, Bartholomew Other? I've known you for more than 10 years. Giving up isn't like you. What were you thinking?" She repeated her question, her voice filled with concern. We sat in silence for a few minutes. The only sound was the beep of the machines while she waited for my reply. "Myra, I'm sorry. For everything. I mean everyone. From Kelly, then you and Grace. I just couldn't handle it. I didn't do any of those things. No one even asked. I felt trapped. My wife told me to go die. My daughter said I was dead to her. My friend betrayed me, and I hurt and disappointed you. I wasn't thinking straight. I got drunk, and in a moment of weakness did something that seemed right to me at the time. I shouldn't be here," I said sadly. She nodded, then carefully sat down at the foot of the bed. "I'm sorry too, Bart," she said quietly, tears welling up in her eyes. "I was angry and upset. I never stopped to consider that you were innocent. I was wrong." "It's okay, Myra." She hushed me. "No, Bart, it's not okay. The fact that you're here and feel that I'm one of the people who pushed you. I don't know if I can forgive myself." Her tears began to fall. "It's all right, Myra. It's all right." I closed my eyes, exhausted. We remained silent for the next few minutes, though Myra refused to let go of my hand. Eventually, we were interrupted by a doctor before either of us could find the right words. He smiled, glancing at my chart as I opened my eyes. "Well, Mr. Other, good to see you awake. How are you feeling?" I shrugged. "Alive. Wasn't expecting that." He frowned, and so did Myra. "So let's make sure we can keep you that way, then," he said, brushing off my grim remark. For the next few minutes, he conducted a thorough examination of me while Myra observed quietly. He carefully removed the bandages from my wrists to inspect the stitches, causing Myra to gasp at the sight of the wounds. After that, he checked my blood pressure and adjusted the IV drip in my arm. "We're mainly administering saline," the doctor explained. "You needed 2 transfusions upon arrival due to significant blood loss. The saline will aid in your body's recovery and hydration. You'll need to take it easy on food for a few days. Unfortunately, we had to pump your stomach to ensure there were no remaining pills when you arrived, which can be uncomfortable. You may feel some itching as a result, but it will pass. Lastly, there's a detective who has been eager to speak with you once you woke up. He's visited a few times already. Ms. Brown has been in touch with him," he concluded, nodding towards Myra. As he finished, I glanced down at the bed, and he reiterated the importance of resting and avoiding movement. After rebandaging my wrists, he left Myra and me alone. I couldn't bring myself to meet her gaze. "So I assume you're here because of my letter?" I ventured. She shook her head. "I haven't seen the letter yet, but Detective Roundlight briefed me about it." Her voice trembling, tears threatening to fall. "My cousin works in administration here and noticed your name on the critical care list. He called me and informed me that you were admitted after attempting to take your own life." Myra's voice trailed off on the last words. I still couldn't look at her, consumed by shame. Myra took a shaky breath but continued. "I was already feeling so low, Bart. After I stormed off, I was furious, but deep down I knew you weren't involved in that embezzlement. I've worked alongside you for years. If anyone should have known whether you were capable of something like stealing, it's me. I should have taken a moment, even in my anger. If I had, I would have realized you were being framed. When Morris, my cousin, called me and said, he said you were here. I just knew you hadn't committed those terrible acts. Bart, I'm so sorry. so incredibly sorry from the depths of my heart." Myra wept, her head resting on my chest, tears soaking through my hospital gown. She kept apologizing, saying she almost lost her best friend. After a few minutes, she gently wiped her face, trying to pull her hand away, but I held on to it. With her other hand, she took a tissue, delicately wiping tears from my eyes, and we shared a shy smile. Taking a deep breath, Myra continued, "As I thought about it more, I couldn't believe you would do something like that. You always loved your job. But when Roger showed me those signed documents, I was furious with you." I stiffened at Roger's name and looked away. "It was him, wasn't it? Roger framed you, didn't he?" she asked quietly. I nodded. "I believe so. I can't prove it, but it fits. The way he avoided discussing the overruns, how he conveniently had signed documents I'd never seen before ready. And I suspect he's the one having an affair with Kelly," I added, pausing with my eyes closed, still holding Myra's hand. "I'm sorry too, Myra. I never imagined Roger or Kelly would involve you in hurting me. But I'm powerless. All the evidence is against me. I can't prove my innocence. That's why I did what I did." I let my words fade, and silence filled the air until a new voice, unfamiliar, interrupted. "Well, I know you can't. They did a good job framing you, forging your signature, to make it seem like you're some criminal mastermind. But real criminals who get away with hundreds of thousands don't act like you." Entering the room was a large, athletic man who looked like a rugby player, exuding the confidence I once had. "Mr. Other, I'm Detective David Roundlight. I, along with your neighbor Mrs. Hawkins, found you. I'm glad to see you're feeling better." I shrugged. "Sorry, Detective, but I'm sure you'll be able to arrest me in a few days when they release me," I replied with bitterness in my voice. I felt Myra's grip tighten around my hand. "About that," Detective Roundlight began. Myra and I both turned to look at him as he ran a hand through his hair. "Now that I've been assigned to your case, I've been reviewing things and some details aren't adding up. Would you be willing to undergo another interview?" "I suppose so. I don't really have anything else to lose," I responded to the detective flatly. "What about getting a lawyer for him?" Myra interjected suddenly. "Doesn't he need a lawyer?" The detective sighed. "Yes, he can have a lawyer. We're not supposed to say anything until it's brought up. But yes, he probably should have one." Myra nodded decisively. She turned to me. "Bart, I'll take care of that." With that, she excused herself, briefly letting go of my hand for only the second time since I woke up. As she left the room, dialing a number on her phone, both the detective and I watched her go. She might have been angry at me for what I'd done, but she was still a knockout, and both of us knew it. "She's into you," Detective Roundlight remarked. I chuckled. "She's been with me for 10 years. We've both had a rough week, so she's a bit protective of me right now." "I think it goes deeper than that. Off the record, I've reviewed your correspondence and talked to her. If your wife ever crosses paths with her, she'll be a force to reckon with." He glanced towards the door she'd exited through. "She really cares about you, Mr. Other. And right now, you need allies." Detective?" I interjected, giving him a questioning look. He met my gaze. "I'm not sure you should be telling me this. After all, you're investigating me." He chuckled. "That's true, Mr. Other, but I believe there's more to your case than those other two dimwits thought. Besides, I overheard your remarks earlier." "You believe you're innocent, don't you?" he asked. Aside from my moment of stupidity, I raised my bandaged wrists. "Of course I'm innocent. I'd never embezzle from a place I used to love working at." "Well then?" He nodded as Myra returned to the room. "My second cousin, Reagan Brown, will be Bart's lawyer," she stated matter-of-factly. Detective Roundlight smiled and handed Myra a card. "I know Ms. Brown. She's excellent. She'll take good care of you, Mr. Other," he assured. He turned to Myra. "Have your cousin contact me once she's spoken with Mr. Other. The sooner the better." The three of us continued to talk for a few more minutes before he departed. "That's unusual," I remarked as he departed. Yeah, normally the police aren't so friendly or on your side, Myra agreed. We sat in silence for a few more uncomfortable minutes. Changing the subject, I asked, "Who's taking care of Tilly while you've been here?" "My mom has her right now. Oh, and—" Myra reached into her handbag and pulled out a drawing. "Tilly made this for you." She smiled as she handed it to me. It was a folded piece of paper with a crayon drawing of a hospital and an ambulance. Inside the hospital, I was depicted in a bed with "Get well soon" written in a child's handwriting. I blinked back a few tears. "Thank you," I said softly. "Have you heard anything from Grace?" Myra shook her head. "No, I've tried calling her a few times, left a couple of messages, but nothing," she replied sadly. We conversed quietly for about 45 minutes until Myra's second cousin, Reagan, arrived. After introductions, Myra excused herself, leaving me with Reagan. Similar to Myra, Reagan possessed a striking beauty, though her hair was sandy brown rather than Myra's platinum blonde. Yet you could tell they were related if seen together. "She likes you. Always has," Reagan remarked during our conversation. I scoffed, recalling Detective Roundlight's similar comment earlier. "She's been my colleague for years," I retorted. Reagan snorted this time. "Men shows what you know." I chuckled. "I think my soon-to-be ex-wife would agree that I'm clueless," I replied, the laughter lacking any real humor. She smiled sadly. "Don't fret over it. I've received an initial briefing and had a word with Detective Roundlight on my way here. Surprisingly, he's supportive of your side. I also have some theories about what's happening to you. Now that we've spoken, leave it to me. Your only fault here is that you loved and trusted someone you perhaps shouldn't have." Reagan gave me a compassionate look as she glanced at my bandages. "I'm sorry, Bart. I've heard a lot about you over the years from Myra. She holds you in high regard, and from what little I know about this past week, she's more devastated by how she treated you than losing her job. She cares deeply about you." As I started to speak, she raised her hand. "Don't worry, Bart," Reagan assured me. "I'll represent both of you in your unfair dismissal case against your former employer. If I'm right, a lot of dominoes are about to fall very quickly. But for now, aside from focusing on your recovery, I need the divorce papers that your soon-to-be ex-wife gave you. Since I'm acting on your behalf, what are your wishes?" My expression darkened. "I want everything I can get," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. Reagan didn't miss the underlying anger. "Kelly and Roger threw me under the bus and probably got away with a significant amount of the firm's money, pinning it on me. You have my full authority to unleash absolute and total destruction on them." She chuckled and then winked. "No prisoners, and don't worry about the casualties." "Got it." I was fond of my new lawyer. Reagan stayed a little longer, asking more about the events leading up to what she called my self-harm incident, then bid me farewell, assuring me everything was under control. She mentioned she'd likely reach out in a few days for a formal police interview once I was discharged. The following days were rather uneventful compared to the previous week. I spent most of my time in the hospital bed undergoing regular checkups by doctors and nurses. Without my phone, which was still at home, I couldn't reach out to anyone. Not that I felt anyone would want to talk to me anyway. Then, Myra showed up the next day with an old paperback, Dan Simmons' Endymion. I chuckled when she handed it to me. It was a book I had enjoyed years ago. As she settled into a chair beside my bed with her own book, Pride and Prejudice, I asked her why she had come. "Silly man, I'm here to take care of you," she replied with a shake of her head but a smile on her face. We spent the day chatting, recounting our recent experiences. At lunchtime, with the doctor's permission, she went out and brought back a roast beef roll drowned in gravy and chips for me, while she enjoyed a chicken wrap herself. Despite the soreness in my wrists, I was beginning to feel more like myself again. The second afternoon, Myra returned home mid-afternoon after being out in the morning. At that moment, The doctors had just removed the IV from my arm and informed me I'd be discharged the next morning pending clear blood test results. Looking at Myra, I confessed, I don't know where to go. I don't even have a phone or wallet to book a hotel room, and I can't go back home. Myra smiled reassuringly. Speaking of home, Reagan obtained a court order to retrieve some of your personal belongings. I managed to get your phone, wallet, a few changes of clothes, your laptop, iPad, and shaving kit. Myra, I was stunned by her kindness. Thank you. Now, I can at least try to find somewhere to stay. She was my only friend in the world. What is it? I asked, noticing her worried expression. She hesitated. You were right about Roger and Kelly, she finally said. When Reagan and I arrived with an officer to collect your things, they were both there in a compromising state. It seems they're living together and weren't expecting visitors. The place smelled of cigarettes and other things. I'm sorry, Bart, she said softly. I sighed. It's okay, Myra. Well, no, it's not. But thank you for being honest with me. What happened when they saw you? She smiled again at the question. At first they yelled at me, demanding that I leave, until the officer warned them to comply with the court order or face arrest. After that, they let me into your room to pack up your belongings. Myra's voice quivered. Bart, the stain, she trailed off, referring to where my blood had likely stained the carpet. Taking a deep breath, she continued, It's still there. If I hadn't been with you since you came in, I would have been terrified. Promise me you won't ever do something like that again. I raised my hands in surrender. I promise, I replied solemnly. The next day, after freshening up at the hospital with a shower and shave, Myra met me as I checked myself out. We walked out together, hand in hand. She led me to her car, and we drove for a few minutes until we arrived at a cluster of condos near Kings Park. Myra, what's going on here? I can't stay at your place? I asked, realizing our destination. Of course you can, silly. No need to waste money on a hotel. You can stay in the guest room for a few days. Besides, Reagan is meeting us here this afternoon. She's very focused on everything about your case, so you wouldn't want to miss it, Myra replied with a smile. I had been to Myra's house a few times before. It was a cozy 2-story home with 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a modest kitchen, and a comfortable living room. With just Myra, Tilly, and occasional visits from her mom, they managed well in the space. Having worked closely with Myra for so long, I knew she had almost paid off her small mortgage on the house. Despite her appearance, Myra wasn't one for parties, and most of her resources went towards caring for Tilly, whom she adored. We brought my suitcases into her home and she showed me the spare bedroom, bathroom, and the rest of the house before Reagan arrived. Reagan arrived approximately an hour later. Upon entering, she sat down and took several folders out of her bag, her expression businesslike. Bartholomew Other, you're a very fortunate man, she said gravely. I swallowed nervously. Your wife and your best friend nearly managed to deceive you and walk away with everything. Currently, your bank accounts, including your savings and the one where the missing money was diverted, are frozen. That account was fraudulently opened in your name. Myra and I exchanged glances as Reagan went on. It appears that over the last few months your supposed friend Roger learned to forge your signature. Then, a couple of months ago, both he and your wife went to a local bank and opened an account under your name. I've obtained video evidence proving it was them. Furthermore, I've taken steps to suspend their passports and initiated legal action against them for fraud and emotional distress. They're in serious trouble, my lawyer informed us, a smile playing on her lips. She continued, I've also commenced legal proceedings against your former employer for wrongful termination for both of you, and I anticipate everything will be in motion by the end of the week. I've spoken with Detective Roundlight, and tomorrow morning we'll go in for a formal interview with him. She looked at me reassuringly. It's standard procedure. Just follow my lead, and you'll be fine. I expect your wife and friend will be arrested very soon. For the next hour, the 3 of us reviewed the details and signed several documents. Reagan assured me that all charges would be dropped by the following day. After she left, I spent a few minutes unpacking clothes in my room and organizing my toiletries in the bathroom. Myra and I spent the afternoon discussing what we expected would happen next. Later, when Myra went to pick up Tilly from school, I finally turned on my phone after several days. What awaited me were numerous missed calls and texts, mostly from Kelly, berating me and urging me to finalize the divorce before I ended up in jail. What intrigued me more were several missed calls from my former workplace over the past 2 days, asking me to call them back at my earliest convenience. However, to my disappointment, there was nothing from Grace. When Myra and Tilly returned home, my worries faded away as the 11-year-old excitedly recounted her day at school. What she did, the friends she played with, and how she proudly spoke about me in the hospital, saying I would be staying with her while recovering. She was full of energy, and I have to admit, I cherished every moment of it. While Myra prepared dinner, I sat down with Tilly. We tackled her homework together and read her school book for reading practice. She was a fantastic reader, and I enjoyed our time reading together. Tilly was like a mini version of Myra, and I knew she would capture hearts when she grew older, too. Her bubbly innocence was something I hoped she would keep for as long as possible. After dinner and showers, the three of us settled in to watch some TV before bedtime. Tilly was eager to share the latest episodes of a kids' show called Bluey with me. Surprisingly, I enjoyed it as much as she did. When it was time for bed, Tilly asked me to tuck her in and requested a hug that nearly brought tears to my eyes. She expressed how glad she was that I was feeling better as she let me go. Afterwards, wiping my eyes, I switched places with Myra as she said goodnight to Tilly. It felt like ages since I'd felt such unconditional love, though the pain of Tilly inadvertently revealing my situation with Grace still stung. Tilly's innocent concern for my feelings was a balm against the loss of connection with Grace. Later, Myra and I sat back on the couch and talked. She often held my hand, and when we finally turned in, she gave me a comforting hug and reassured me that everything would be okay. The next day, we went for the interview. Detective Roundlight and Regan confirmed that all charges against me were dropped immediately afterward. That night's news reported Kelly and Roger were wanted on charges of fraud and identity theft, but they remained elusive. Later that night, Grace attempted to call me for the first time, but I let it go to voicemail. I wasn't ready to speak with her yet. The next day passed in mixed feelings. Grace called me several times and even sent me a couple of messages urging me to call her back. But I wasn't ready to talk to her yet. It was only after my recovery that she began to show concern. I was angry. She fired me without thinking and ignored Myra's attempts to contact her when I was in the hospital. Now that the truth about her mother and Roger's role had become known, she suddenly wanted to talk. My daughter may face some consequences for some time. However, that night I had a nightmare. I was at home and had just cut myself with a razor when Kelly and Roger came in and started having fun on the bed when I needed help. Meanwhile, Myra, Grace, and John stood in the doorway and taunted me while I lay helpless. I woke up sweating and screaming loudly. Before I could realize what was happening, Myra was there, wide-eyed and smiling worriedly. Even Tilly was standing in the doorway, tears streaming down her face. I covered my face with my hands and cried. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry, I can't." Eventually, I started to calm down, and they both climbed onto my bed. Myra was leaning over me on one side, and Tilly was sitting on the other. I felt Myra wrap her arms around my neck and hug me tightly. "It's all right, Uncle Bart," Tilly reassured me. "You had a bad dream. It happens sometimes. Mom and I will stay with you, and you go to bed." I tried to go back to sleep, but I couldn't. After a while, I felt Tilly dozing off with her little hand on my stomach, but I could feel Myra watching me. "Are you all right, Bart?" she asked with genuine concern in her voice, continuing to hug me like a caring mother. I hesitated for a moment. "No, Myra, I'm sorry, but I don't think so." It was a dream about that night. When I couldn't finish the sentence. I believe Myra understood my unspoken words because she leaned in and kissed my cheek, then nestled into my neck. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Myra is a striking woman in her mid-30s, exuding a magnetic allure that could ignite a spark with just a glance. Since Kelly left me in limbo, it seemed like a few weeks ago, I haven't had any vulgar thoughts, but I found myself reacting when her body pressed against mine. If it weren't for the sleeping child beside us, I might have acted differently, but I'm relieved I didn't, especially when I felt Myra's tears gently wetting my neck. "What are we going to do, Bart?" she whispered tearfully. "It's not fair. You don't deserve this." Her voice was heavy with anguish and sympathy for me. "Shh," I reassured her, wrapping my arm around her and pulling her close, careful not to disturb Tilly, who snuggled beside me, lightly snoring. "We'll figure it out. It'll be okay." In that moment, I felt a sense of grounding return to me. Myra's concern and empathy for my situation brought me back to myself for the first time since that night. I held both Myra and Tilly close until the sun rose and a new day began. The next morning, I received warm hugs from both women. We had breakfast together, and then Myra took Tilly to school. I used the opportunity to begin searching for a counselor because I knew I needed help. By the time Myra returned, I had already made a few calls to find support. Myra greeted me with a wide smile, which quickly turned more serious. "Ah, Bart, can we talk about something?" she asked, leading me to the couch where we both sat down. I looked at her, nodding, thinking I understood what she wanted to discuss. "It's okay, Myra," I assured her. "I understand. Last night was tough. Having Tilly here, it's not ideal if I wake up screaming. I'll find somewhere else." Her eyes widened, and she quickly placed her hands on mine, a look of panic crossing her face. "No, Bart, that's not it," she said, taking a deep breath. "In fact, it's the opposite. Bart, I don't quite know how to say this, but I need to—" I gazed at Myra, her expression both painfully beautiful and bewildering. "Bart, I'm in love with you," Myra suddenly blurted out. Talk about being hit with unexpected news. "Sorry," I stammered dumbly. "I said I'm in love with you. I have been for a long time," she repeated, her tone now more reserved, a faint blush on her cheeks. I leaned back as she smiled gently at me, studying my expression. "I'm sorry, Bart, but I can't keep it in any longer," Myra said, her words sinking in. "When I heard you were in the hospital, I panicked. I rushed over as fast as I could. I felt so guilty for losing my temper with you earlier, telling myself I wouldn't express how I truly felt. But then you almost died. And after everything with your wife and best friend, you came here. I thought I didn't need to say anything because you were here with Tilly and me. I thought you'd realize sooner or later. But Myra, why now? What prompted this?" I asked. She chuckled softly, a hint of sadness in her laughter. You oblivious fool. Last night happened. You were hurting. It broke my heart to see you like that, but I was there for you, and you fell asleep in my arms. I hoped I could ease your pain. I cared so deeply for you. I couldn't— Bart, I can't keep it inside anymore." Myra's eyes flicked quickly to mine. "And as for why it's always been you, have you ever noticed I never date?" she said, tilting her head. "Yeah," I nodded, tilting my head in curiosity. "But I always assumed it was because of Tilly." "That's part of it," Myra hesitated. "But Bart, the truth is I've never found anyone who could compare to you." Myra tilted her head towards me curiously and smiled. "You know," she began, "ever since I started working with you, you've always treated me the same as everyone else. You take the time to explain everything. You're kind to everyone. You help them learn from mistakes. And with Tilly, you're so friendly, you make her feel special when you help with homework or read together. She never knew her father, but she sees you as her own father. Just look at how she came to comfort you last night when you were in pain." "But Myra," I began to protest. She raised her hand to stop me. "Last week, when everything came crashing down on us, you tried to deal with everything alone. You didn't scream or get angry. You didn't treat me badly even when I was upset or snapped." Myra blushed. "You are an incredible person. Bartholomew is different. I love you for that, among many other reasons. And if Kelly is stupid enough to let you go, I will take you away with such love that in a month you won't even remember her name." She came over and settled down next to me, bending down to kiss me. I soon responded by wrapping her in my arms. Time seemed to have stopped. It wasn't long before I felt her desire. Finally, she pulled away, her eyes filled with deep, sensual desire. "Are you ready, Bart? Will you make me yours?" Myra asked. "I've just been proposed to by one of the most attractive women I've ever met. If I were honest with myself, I would admit that I had fantasized about her before, and suddenly I had a chance. But everything happened quickly. I knew that Kelly and I had no future anymore. Myra's declaration of love for me was a significant discovery for me. I felt that Myra understood my inner conflict, but she remained silent, took my hand and led me to her bedroom. Finally, when she got to her bedroom, she turned around and kissed me. The next few hours were great. After that, we fell asleep. In the dream, I found myself in a situation similar to the previous one. Kelly and Roger were intimate in bed, and I felt despair again. Then, unexpectedly, the beautiful Myra entered the room, gently touched my wrists, healed my wounds, and led me away from the disturbing scene. We woke up to the sound of the alarm clock. I was shaking and sweating, but I didn't scream, held tightly by Myra. While we were getting dressed, I recounted my dream. Myra's expression became concerned, and she took me with her when she went to pick up Tilly from school. A few more weeks passed, but eventually Roger and Kelly were arrested. They found out about the police's interest after the charges against me were dropped. In a panic, they fled from Perth to Adelaide and were detained by Australian customs while trying to leave the country. It took the West Australian police 2 months to bring them back to Perth. But during that time, my bond with Myra has noticeably strengthened. After that first night, I moved into her bedroom, which has now become our bedroom, and I must admit, I felt rejuvenated, as if I were in my 20s again. We made love almost every night. Her body, mind, and soul seemed completely mine when we were together. Obviously, I fell head over heels in love with her. When the police took Roger and Kelly back to Perth, I realized that Myra was right. I could hardly remember my meetings with Kelly, and I didn't want to remember them. Myra, like me, had only one person, her unreliable boyfriend, who passed away. A month after Roger and Kelly were returned to Perth, Myra and I found ourselves in court with Reagan, testifying against them. Roger never looked at me directly, even when I was a witness. As a result, he was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Kelly, on the other hand, stared at me steadily throughout the trial. During the trial, it turned out that Roger was the mastermind behind everything, including manipulating Kelly and organizing the fraud. Despite this, Kelly unexpectedly received a 20-year sentence for her participation. She was found to be an accomplice to the fraud, and she was charged with additional charges of mental abuse related to her actions against me, supported by evidence obtained from hidden cameras that she installed for Roger, which led to an additional 5 years in prison. The judge granted our divorce immediately after the verdict. Reagan mentioned dividing our savings when Kelly served me with the divorce papers. Reagan also stated my willingness to sell the house and split the proceeds right away, as I had no intention of remaining in a place where such terrible things had occurred. Additionally, Reagan informed the court that I agreed to act as trustee for Kelly's funds until she completed her sentence. It took a lot of persuasion from Reagan for me to agree to this. However, it demonstrated my willingness to reconcile to some extent and significantly reduced the trivial disputes that often arise in divorces. I was not allowed to use Kelly's funds directly, but I could invest them alongside any other funds I invested elsewhere. The courts decided that Roger and Kelly must begin serving their sentences immediately. After the ruling, during the closing statements, Kelly's lawyer requested that I spend an hour with her before she was taken to prison, which I reluctantly agreed to amidst the scrutiny of the courtroom. Kelly arrived at the interview room, still in her court attire, right after the session ended. The room was decently furnished, although the table was secured and the chairs were equipped with chains to prevent them from being moved. Despite this, Kelly appeared crestfallen and defeated, much like how I felt betrayed by her actions. She sat with slumped shoulders, avoiding eye contact, unlike in the courtroom. The prison escort informed us she would wait just outside and we could signal when we were finished. There was no rush. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. It was the first time we had been alone together since Kelly had asked me to do something that I had ultimately tried to carry out. "I'm sorry, Bart," she murmured quietly, staring down at her hands. I was somewhat taken aback that she initiated the conversation and that her first words were an apology. It was a far cry from the last words we exchanged, which were much more contentious. "Are you Kelly?" I asked, unable to mask the bitterness in my voice. She looked up at me, tears welling in her eyes, but not yet falling. "Yes, Bart, I'm so sorry," I started to respond, ready to dismiss her apology, but she gestured for me to pause. So, I waited in silence. "Please, Bart, let me explain first. Then you can criticize me," Kelly said sadly. I leaned back in my chair, motioning for her to continue. "Thank you," she said remorsefully, meeting my gaze directly for the first time since she entered the room. "Believe it or not, Bart, I am truly sorry. I don't know what came over me. For years, I loved you. I still do, despite what I've done. But worse than that, I knew how much you loved me. You were the perfect husband and partner. But one day, I woke up feeling lost." She looked away, staring down at her hands, then resumed speaking. "So, you see, a few weeks after feeling lost, things started to spiral. I grew increasingly agitated towards you because you still loved me despite my inner turmoil. Roger was around working with you on that damn project, and he noticed something was wrong with me." She nervously clasped her hands together. It took another month before the affair began. Roger was persistent. He knew exactly how to manipulate me. I still loved you, but he exploited my vulnerabilities and got me into bed. After that, he used my guilt to execute his plan. You probably never knew, but Roger was always envious of your leadership abilities. He felt he was always second to you, which ate away at him. He concocted a scheme to deceive a client into paying a large sum for something that never existed, framing you for the theft. To my shame, both of us conspired against you, initiating everything. We opened a new bank account in your name and orchestrated your downfall step by step. We were aware of your unconditional trust and affection. And by the end, Roger calculated that with you in prison, he could use his money, our savings, and the stolen funds to start fresh in another country. We believed we could evade consequences if caught, Kelly explained, shaking her head at her own admission. In the meantime, I replied, attempting to conceal my anger, neither of you considered the devastation you were causing me. She nodded sadly. Initially, I resisted, but Roger was relentless. He gradually wore me down until I reluctantly agreed. For our plan to work, you had to be so broken that you wouldn't suspect a thing. You almost succeeded, I interjected. If it hadn't been for Detective Roundlight and Myra, you might have gotten away with it. We fell silent for a moment. Then Kelly quietly asked, "Can I see them?" I understood her meaning and slowly placed my arms on the table, palms up. Kelly gasped, tears welling in her eyes as she saw my scars. She reached out hesitantly but pulled back her hands. I remained outwardly impassive, though inside a tumult of emotions raged, from rage to shame, and even a hint of lingering affection despite everything she had done. Admitting it grated on me. Perhaps I failed to conceal these feelings, as Kelly glanced up at me and tensed. I'm sorry, Bart. I deeply regret what prompted you to such terrible thoughts. I... She trailed off. I'm going to accept the 20-year sentence without appeal. After what I did to you, I deserve it. I nodded, relieved that she would face justice without hesitation. She looked back at me. Bart? Kelly met my gaze. I want you to know, you were never bad in bed. Compared to Roger, who thought he was great but was actually useless, you were amazing. It was always about him. He never cared about my pleasure like you did. I have no excuse for what I did to you that last morning. I was wrong. We sat in silence for a moment. So you and Myra? She asked cautiously. Yeah, I replied, a bit unsure. She managed a faint smile. Good. She's loved you for years, you know, my now ex-wife stated matter-of-factly. I've come to realize that recently, I replied. I was stunned by the intensity of emotion in her voice when she said the following. Let her love you, Bart. Let her heal the wounds I've inflicted on you. Tears were streaming down her face, but she didn't take her eyes off me. I have no right to give you advice. But she loves you, unlike me. She would never betray you. She loved you silently for years, never once trying to take you away. I failed the first test. She has everything that I don't have, my ex-wife said sadly. Kelly, I hesitated, not knowing what to say. Don't worry, she said, wiping her tears with her sleeve. I'll be fine. I agreed to your terms. I was surprised that you were so kind and managed my money while I was in prison. You are better than I could have imagined. I sighed. Kelly, I once loved you more than you thought. If you'd just talked to me about your feelings, maybe we could have avoided all this. But I'm trying my best to forget everything you've done to me. I still have a lot of anger in me. I want to yell at you. I want to blame you for what you did. But I can't, Kelly. I was the one who was trying to do something bad to myself. There was a moment of silence between us. Bart, Kelly said, meeting my gaze again. I'm so sorry for what I did to you. You deserve the best from me. I have the same responsibility, if not more, for pushing you. I will always be ashamed. I read your letter, and you were right. I will pay for what I did. But I'm grateful to God that you're still alive. I clenched my teeth for a moment. The emotions swirling inside me remained strong. How could Kelly say those things now? How could she take on the responsibility and try to strip away the anger and pain I held on to? It wasn't fair, so I changed the subject. I suggested managing your finances out of respect for our history together. It'll give you enough to start fresh when you're out if you choose, I said, attempting to hide my emotions, though failing miserably. Kelly saw through my weak attempt to conceal them, but she accepted the shift in conversation with a bitter laugh. By then, I'll likely be in my 60s. Hopefully, it'll be enough to retire. 60 isn't so old, I replied. Stay strong inside, and you'll be going strong into your 80s. We talked a bit more about how she wanted to handle her money. It eased both of us a little, but I sensed she wanted to broach another topic. Have you talked to Grace? She asked, hesitating slightly. I shook my head. Grace pretty much cut me off, said I was dead to her, and believed every lie you and your lover fed her. That conversation shattered me. I glanced at Kelly, and she winced at the pain and sorrow in my eyes. Kelly. She never questioned if I was innocent, never gave me the benefit of the doubt. She just cast me aside without a second thought. Right after that call, I trailed off, turning away so Kelly wouldn't see my tears. As I cried silently, if I had turned back, I would have seen Kelly crying too. She understood what I couldn't bring myself to say. I continued speaking with my back turned to Kelly. During my time in the hospital, Myra attempted to reach out to her, but there was no response. Mimicking Kelly's earlier gesture, I wiped my face on my sleeve, then turned to sit back down just as Kelly was attempting to dry her tears. "I'm sorry, Bart." Kelly winced, her voice pained. "A lot of what happened was orchestrated by Roger and me. It's a source of eternal shame that we planned for Grace to turn against you." I nodded, feeling anger flash in my eyes as Kelly confessed to her role, bowing her head in shame. I was on the verge of unleashing my fury at her for ruining my relationship with our daughter, but she already knew the damage she had caused. "To be honest," Kelly said sadly, "Grace has also cut me out of her life. I haven't been scolded that harshly since childhood, but I know I deserved it and more." "Bart," Kelly suddenly interjected with urgency, her sorrow replaced by something more insistent. "Our little girl needs you. She's scared and lashing out at everyone. Right now, she and John are arguing nonstop, and you know that's not like them." In a softer tone, Kelly added, "I'm worried about her. This is my fault, but I can't fix it. I know she feels guilty about how she treated you, and your silence is only making it worse." Kelly paused for a moment. "Bart, I know I have no right to ask anything of you," Kelly said, pausing to meet my gaze as she wrung her hands. "But could you find it in your heart to forgive Grace? Our daughter needs at least one of her parents. Even if I weren't facing a long prison sentence, the guilt of what I've done to you and turning Grace against you would have tormented me. It's better this way, that you're the one to pick her up. If you had died, I don't know what she would have done. Please, Bart, if nothing else, take care of our daughter," pleaded my ex-wife. "Kelly," I took a deep breath, considering my response. "What you're asking is difficult. You hurt me deeply, but you were my wife, not my blood. When Grace told me she wanted nothing to do with me, that I was dead to her the day after you told me to go die, it hurt more than what you did to me. I want to reconcile with her, but the pain, Kelly, the pain of what my family did, what our daughter did, I don't know how to move past it." Kelly nodded sadly. "I understand," she said softly, acknowledging the enormity of the hurt I felt. She knew firsthand the pain of being rejected. She was living it now. I sighed, meeting her gaze. "Look, Kelly, for what it's worth, I'm trying hard not to harbor hatred toward you. I'm seeking professional help, but it's a struggle not to lash out. As for Grace, I can't promise anything, but I'll consider talking to her soon." She looked shattered. This conversation had visibly aged her. There was little more to say. She stood up. "Bart, I know my words may mean very little now, but I'll say it again. I'm sorry for everything I've done to you. I have no excuses, and I can never fully make amends. I'll serve my time, and though forgiveness may never come, I hope for it. You may not believe me, but I still and always will love you. I lost sight of that, but it's still true." Kelly's voice trailed off, wrinkles now etched across her face. We stood there in an uncomfortable silence. Tears streamed down Kelly's cheeks once more as she approached the door and knocked. Her prison escort opened it, and before leaving, Kelly paused, glancing back at me. "Love Myra and Bart. Give them the love I foolishly let slip away. Live a wonderful life and be proud. You have people who care deeply for you. Remember, even in your darkest moments, there's always someone willing to lift you up. I lost sight of that. But Bart, I'm proud of who you're becoming." "Goodbye, my dear," Kelly said sadly as she departed. And with that, she walked out of the room. I reflected on our conversation. There had been no shouting, just Kelly accepting responsibility and her sentence. As I left the room myself, I noticed a trail of tears on the tiled floor where Kelly had walked. For a moment, I mourned what we once had, then turned and walked in the opposite direction. I was escorted out of the secure area and into the public gallery, where my spirits lifted upon seeing Myra waiting for me. Despite the solemnity of the occasion, my assistant-turned-girlfriend looked stunning. Her skirt accentuated her figure, and her blouse subtly highlighted her beauty. Her long blonde hair cascaded down her shoulders to just above her waist. She melted into my embrace effortlessly, planting a tender kiss on my lips. "Did everything go all right?" she inquired. "Yeah," I responded. It was surprising. I expected a lot of excuses and blame directed at me. But she took much of the responsibility and showed me a surprising amount of remorse. "How do you feel about that?" Myra asked. I paused, still holding Myra. "Honestly, I'm still very angry at Roger and her. But unlike Roger, I also feel sorry for her. She knows she's ruined everything in her life and is now facing the consequences. Apparently, Grace has also cut Kelly out of her life for what she did." Myra nodded thoughtfully. After a moment, she hesitated. "About that?" She glanced at me, then continued. "John and Grace are here. While you were with Kelly, John came up to me and said they'll be at the cafe across the street for the next few hours if you want to talk. He knows how upset you are. Apparently, they've been arguing a lot over how Grace treated you, but she's eager to see you." I took a deep breath and looked at Myra. "You think I should talk to her, don't you?" I asked. Myra nodded. "I do, my love. There's a pain in your soul that I can't heal. Only Grace can. But if it helps, I'll come with you. I'll be by your side for as long as you need. And," she smiled at me, "if you need Mama Bear to come out, I'll still defend you fiercely." "I love you, Bart," she declared with conviction. I leaned in and kissed her. "I love you too, Myra." Her eyes widened, my first public declaration of love for her. We drew some attention from people passing by, lawyers, judges, and criminals alike. But in that moment, I couldn't care less. Myra was the only person I could see. "Let's go then," I said. And we strolled hand in hand across the street. Upon entering the cafe, Myra and I immediately spotted my daughter and her fiancé. As we approached their table, Grace seemed torn between fleeing and engulfing me in a hug. I leaned into the embrace somewhat. Opening my arms, Grace nestled against me, and soon my shirt was damp with her tears. "I'm sorry, Daddy," she repeated for a couple of minutes. I glanced at Myra, who smiled knowingly, and John, who looked uncertain. Finally, after a few moments, I gently pulled her away and we sat down. We each ordered drinks and a light snack, and I decided to break the ice. "I just spoke with your mother," I said quietly. Grace nodded. "I heard, Daddy. I'm sorry, it's just—" I raised my hand to stop her. It was my turn now. "I understand, Gracie. I know you're sorry. Your mother explained a lot, but you need to realize how much your words hurt me." It was more painful than anything I've ever felt before. In that moment, I felt abandoned by someone I thought would always stand by me, regardless of the circumstances. What hurt the most was that you never even asked if I was innocent. Grace blushed deeply. Her embarrassment was plain to see on her face. "Dad, She took a deep breath and squared her shoulders. "No, I need to say this," she muttered to herself more than anyone else. I noticed John remained silent but gave her hand a supportive squeeze. "Dad, I'm sorry. I should have given you a chance to respond. I should have let you explain, but I didn't. I can't blame my actions on Roger or Mum. But they kept telling me how much you had messed up, how you were going to jail, how you were having an affair." She glanced at Myra. "Mum, with Roger's help, kept insisting how deceitful you were. Their arguments were persuasive. By the time you called, I was so upset that I said a lot of things I regret." John nodded, and I assumed this had been a major source of their arguments. "Dad, when Myra left messages about you being in the hospital, I thought it was all a ploy. Mum and Roger were still bad-mouthing you, and Myra was the one they claimed you were conspiring with." Grace kept glancing between Myra and me. "They said you were just seeking attention since Myra was part of your scheme. But is it true, Dad? Did you try to... She couldn't finish the sentence. None of us could. I nodded and swallowed, lifting my wrists to show her my scars. I'm sorry, Gracie. Yes, I was in a very dark place and couldn't see a way out. I got quite drunk at my lowest point and did something I regret, I said slowly, swallowing hard. It was still difficult to admit, but I knew I had to. I needed to show my daughter what her actions had driven me to do. At my admission, Grace broke down again, sobbing into her hands. Myra melted into my side, and both our emotions threatened to break as well. For a few moments, no one said anything. John looked at us. I don't mean to downplay the seriousness of the situation, but I'd like to give Grace a moment to compose herself. John looked at us and smiled. Can I assume that something good came out of all this? He said, gesturing to Myra and me snuggling. Grace lifted her head, and after a moment her eyes widened. Dad, you and Myra? She asked, surprised. Yes, I nodded, feeling the need to explain. But it wasn't an affair like your mother told you. I never cheated on your mother. When I woke up in the hospital, Myra refused to leave me. You don't know this, but Myra also believed what Roger and your mother were saying for a while. We made up, and I found out how much this woman loves me. Myra blushed, wrapped her arms around my waist, and gave me a quick kiss. John smiled, and Grace looked at us, wide-eyed, then seemed to find herself. Thank you, she said to Myra. Thank you for being there for my dad when I was being foolish. Myra laughed, easing the tension a bit. For the next couple of hours, we talked. Sometimes we shared our experiences individually, and other times as a group. At one point, I even had Grace swap places with Myra so my daughter could hold me. I would love to say that our meeting healed all wounds, but it took months before we felt comfortable enough to talk to each other without feeling like we were walking on eggshells. However, Grace and I worked on it, gradually rebuilding our father-daughter relationship. Grace even attended counseling with me a few times. My therapist helped us address some unresolved issues, such as trust, that lingered after our initial meeting at the cafe. One of the tough sessions involved me asking Grace not to completely cut her mother out of her life. Yes, Kelly had been manipulative and deceitful, but she was paying the price, and she was still her mother. Grace agreed to meet with her, provided I accompanied her the first time. That was a challenging meeting. Not much was said because there was a lot of hurt between the three of us, but Grace made an effort. The following week, Kelly wrote to me expressing her gratitude for convincing Grace to see her. 6 months later, after everything had happened, I asked Myra to marry me. I proposed during a family dinner. Tilly and Grace cheered, saying it was about time, while John shook my hand and told me to take care of her. I laughed as he repeated the same line I had once told him. Shortly after, Grace and John got married. With my approval, Myra visited Kelly in prison to ask if she would allow her to take on the mother of the bride duties. Kelly reportedly cried but agreed. Tilly was a beautiful flower girl and called everyone her second daughter. From that moment on, I was no longer Uncle Bart, but Dad. Reconnecting with Grace, I walked her down the aisle and gave her away to a very proud husband. During our father-daughter dance, she snuggled into me and whispered a prayer of thanks. That night, I felt the last remnants of my reluctance to be around Grace fade away. Later, Grace even sent a series of photos and a letter to Kelly, thanking her for giving Myra permission to act in her place. I understand Kelly keeps them on her cell wall. As the dust settled over the criminal case with Roger and Kelly, Reagan negotiated a significant settlement for both Myra and me at work. For a while, Clarence refused to budge, insisting he had done nothing wrong. But a week before our court date, he made an offer, which Reagan rejected as low and insulting. Then, 2 days before court, he made another offer, which Reagan countered, resulting in Myra receiving a high 6-figure payout, while I got a solid 7-figure payout. As a multi-million-dollar engineering company, our payout was minor compared to the potential damage of a public lawsuit. However, rumors had already spread, and Clarence's revenues took a significant hit until he retired and sold the company for less than 30% of its value when I worked there. With the money from our settlements, Myra and I launched our own engineering consulting firm. We offered administrative and engineering expertise. Within 6 months, we had 5 employees working for us, traveling around the country and assisting with major engineering projects. Surprisingly, one of our first clients was Peter Pembroke. He took Myra and me out to dinner and apologized to us. Once everything was revealed, he realized that we had all been manipulated, and he acknowledged that the project nearly failed without my engineering skills coordinating the delivery. After that, Myra and I received invitations to every significant Pembroke event, regardless of whether we were working on their projects. Peter was a good guy, put in a tough situation, and he wanted to make amends. We also sold Myra's small home and bought a much larger house not far down the road with an amazing view of Kings Park. It was an older 5-bedroom, 3-bathroom home, and we spent over 2 years restoring it. It was a fun time. We only took breaks for family holidays, our wedding, and the birth of Grace and Tilly's little brother Byron. Life improved, although I still had some bad dreams occasionally, but Myra was my rock and was always there when I needed her. More than a decade later, Byron had grown into a bright 10-year-old. Tilly was now in university, following Aunt Regan's path and studying law. One lazy Saturday afternoon, Grace and John were with us on the front deck of our home overlooking Kings Park. Byron was playing Xbox with my 7-year-old grandson, Bruce, while they tried to ignore my 5-year-old granddaughter, Hope. It was then that Grace mentioned her mother. "Dad, I got a letter from Mum this week," she said casually but cautiously. Although Kelly wasn't a forbidden topic in the house, we all treaded lightly when discussing her. Over the years, I had received a few letters from Kelly and had even visited her a few times. I knew she was in therapy and had a supportive community in the prison. Despite having 8 years left on her sentence, she was well respected as a model prisoner. "What did she say?" I asked. "Among other things, she mentioned that she heard Roger was released last month," Grace said, and a silence fell over us. I quietly sipped my Kraken and Coke. "Last month?" I asked, concerned. Myra's hand suddenly rested on mine. "Did she say anything else?" Myra asked Grace. Grace nodded. "Yes, she said he came to see her. Mum says he didn't look well. Life in prison wasn't easy for Roger, according to her letter. I'll visit her next week to find out more, but she mentioned their conversation was far from peaceful." We discussed it for a few more minutes before I excused myself and called David Roundlight. Over the years, he had become a friend. David now led a major crimes team and had solved several complex cases, earning considerable media attention. "Bart, how are you, my friend? How's your lovely wife?" He greeted me warmly as he answered my call. I couldn't help but smile. "Myra is great." I paused. "David, I just heard Roger was released." I could sense David's tone become serious. "Yeah, I got the report yesterday. I was planning to tell you at bowling next week." David and I were on the same bowling team on Tuesday evenings. According to the report, he's been approved to move to Adelaide. It seems he's secured a job with a small company there. During his probation interview, the panel asked about you and if he intended to have any contact. He told them that you could rot in hell for ruining his life, but acknowledged that he had to move away because no one would hire him here in Western Australia due to his record. I sighed as Peter continued. The report mentions that life in prison was tough for him. He got into several fights, losing most of them. Eventually, he became a librarian to avoid most of the other prisoners. I don't think you'll have any issues with him if that's what you were worried about. Thanks, David. That was my concern. If I hear anything from him, I'll let you know, I replied, releasing a breath I didn't realize I was holding. We chatted about bowling and an upcoming barbecue for a few minutes before I walked back to the table. As I sat down, Myra looked at me. "David?" she asked. I nodded. He confirmed that Roger is out and moving to Adelaide. Naturally, he hates my guts. Honestly, the feeling is mutual, I told the family. The rest of the afternoon was a bit subdued, but being with my family made sure I felt supported. That night I woke up sweating and screaming from the first nightmare I'd had in years. In a dream, Roger came at night and tied us all up. He began to threaten all my loved ones. Myra woke up immediately. I was covered in sweat and couldn't stop rubbing my wrists while she tried to calm me down. Without hesitation, Myra called my therapist, who kindly took the call at 2 a.m. After all, that's what we paid him so much for. I explained my dream, and Myra was crying, clinging tightly to me. Telling my wife about it upset her, but it made me feel better. My therapist listened as I described this dream, noting that it was probably caused by the news of Roger's release and the anxiety I still felt about what happened more than 13 years ago. We set up a follow-up meeting, and I thanked him for answering my call so early. When we lay down again, Myra checked on Byron, who, oddly enough, was still asleep. Tilly woke up but went back to sleep after hearing us talking on the phone and asked her mother to tell me that she loves me. I lay down after visiting the bathroom, and Myra snuggled up to me. We made love for almost half an hour. After a quick shower, we returned to bed. "Do you really think there's going to be a problem with Roger?" Myra asked, a little worried. "No, I don't think so," I said. "I think he's going to leave and we'll never hear from him again. And even if we do, you know we have protection." I hinted at my hunting gear, safely stored in our dressing room. Myra nodded in the dark. "Good. I'm sorry, my love, that the news of this upset you. Are you okay?" "Sort of," I replied. "Unfortunately, I think there will always be a shadow there. I don't think about those days very often anymore. But it will always be a part of me. But when I think about those times, I usually focus on the beautiful blonde who burst in on me and saved my life." Myra lifted her head and looked at me. "I'm serious, my love," I told her. I felt so helpless back then that I thought there was no other option but to end it all. I might have done it again if you hadn't been there when I woke up. I've come to understand that this isn't something that gets better on its own. Ignoring it won't help. The best I can do is surround myself with the people I love, reminding me of everything I have to be thankful for, and talk to you when I need to, so I don't end up back in that dark place. Myra nodded. "I love you, Bart," she said. "I love you too, Myra," I replied. With that, we fell asleep. While we didn't always live happily ever after, there were both good and bad days. Yes, there were fights and disagreements and more nightmares. But through it all, I learned that I had the unconditional love of a woman who made everything possible, friends who accepted me for who I was, and family that stood by me regardless of life's storms.